Welcome to FanFic Nation, where worlds are reborn, heroes defy their fate, and what if becomes legend. From epic conflicts to untold paths, this is the nation of fan made stories. Subscribe and step beyond the canon. This novel is written by JD 787. Before the time travel, Aegor often wondered how did a family like the Starks, full of so called idiots, according to the plot, managed to hold the North for thousands of years, and even triumph over several families vying for the title of King in the North. Now, as an outsider in this world, he has to examine the issue more deeply and fundamentally. Over time, he gradually realized that Eddard Stark's seemingly pedantic, stiff, and naive behavior in Game of Thrones wasn't the fault of the Stark family, nor was it solely due to Eddard's immaturity or stupidity. It had been preordained from the beginning. Eddard wasn't raised as someone who would play the Game of Thrones. He wasn't groomed to be an heir, but rather as a second son raised in the Vale. In this era, many prominent families, in order to avoid internal conflicts, would raise their heirs and younger sons differently. The eldest son, destined to inherit the family, would not only be taught how to govern and command but also when to act noble and honorable, and when to set morality aside to protect the family's interests. Meanwhile, second sons were only required to be brave, upright, and loyal, as their role was to assist their elder brothers, not to act independently. To put it simply, the eldest son needed to be cunning, while the rest of the siblings were intentionally kept simpler. A sibling too competent could endanger the family hierarchy. Eddard received the latter type of training. At the age of 8, he was sent to the Eyrie as Jon Arryn's ward to strengthen the alliance between the North and the Vale. Lord Arryn, upright and noble as he was, helped train Eddard into a qualified second son, much like Benjen Stark, the responsible chief ranger of the Night's Watch, whom Aegor was already familiar with. In and of itself, there was nothing wrong with this. The real problem arose when Eddard's older brother Brandon Stark was killed by the Mad King. In a backward and tumultuous era, the death of an heir wasn't uncommon. Typically, the family would quickly pick another child and begin grooming them to take on the role of heir. However, Eddard's situation was far more complicated. His father, Rickard Stark, was also executed by the Mad King on the same day his eldest son was killed. Thus, a second son who had been groomed as a loyal subordinate suddenly found himself thrust into the role of Lord of Winterfell and head of the Stark family without any prior training. Such a situation was rare enough, but what made matters worse was that the rebellion against the Mad King, the Usurper's War, was ignited by this very tragedy. Eddard not only lacked his father's guidance, but he also had no time to be mentored by other elders. Eddard lacked the experience and wisdom necessary to lead a family. Fortunately, he wasn't alone in fighting the Targaryens. During the hastily initiated rebellion, he was supported and guided by two seasoned leaders, Hoster Tully, his father-in-law and Lord of Riverrun, and Jon Arryn, his former guardian and the Lord of the Vale. Together with Robert Baratheon, they managed to topple the Targaryen dynasty despite many setbacks. By the time the rebellion ended, Eddard had become a celebrated warrior with immense prestige throughout the realm. As the oldest surviving member of the Stark family, he held unrivaled power as the Warden of the North. There was no one left qualified to teach him how to govern or transform him into a more fitting ruler. Thus Eddard retained the honor and integrity he had learned as a second son and began ruling the North. Fortunately, the North, poor and remote as it was, lacked the kind of intricate conspiracies and power struggles seen in the South. In this context, his second son qualities didn't lead to significant missteps. As a result, Eddard not only adhered to his own virtuous principles but also raised all of his children to be qualified second sons. And the results of this upbringing became evident when Robb Stark, without the education and training of an eldest son, made one blunder after another after becoming king in the north. He insulted the powerful House Frey without realizing the consequences, executed Rickard Karistar, a key ally during wartime, and walked blindly into the Red Wedding without any precautions. If Brandon Stark had lived, would the children he raised have made such politically ignorant decisions? So, those who still mock Eddard as foolish naive, or idealistic should reconsider. Eddard was a product of Westerosi society, a qualified second son miscast by fate and by a king who lacked the foresight to see his limitations. Everything stems from the second son education. Aegor's current mission was to protect this man who had been misplaced by destiny, a pedantic and stubborn individual. The reasoning was simple. Having such an honorable man who respected the Night's Watch and could be easily manipulated, as hand of the king was in Aegor's best interest for the time being. It's a deal then, no cheating tomorrow. The Night's Watch does not tell lies. After seeing off Arya, who had left beaming with excitement over their agreement, Aegor let out a long sigh. Supporting someone hopeless was undoubtedly exhausting. Thankfully, he'd been lucky with his first move, unraveling his opponent's plan with a single rumor. For now, he had some breathing room before the next crisis. Well, I'll write a letter to the wall when I get back to the inn. But first, I need to figure out how to persuade Commander Mormont to cancel or at least delay the Ranger expedition. I'll also need to catch two whites and send them south to prove to these skeptics that the threat is real. Stretching his body, Aegor walked into the outer room with Tyrion, only to find the second member of the Night's Watch he'd recruited, Akun, sitting upright at a desk in the office lobby, dutifully minding his post. Aegor rubbed his temples. He wasn't sure how to handle this pretender. If he dismissed him now, the problem might seem easy to solve, but there was always the chance Akun would sneak into the Red Keep to cause trouble. If that happened, things could turn disastrous. It's closing time, let's go, Aegor said to Jaqen, deciding to let the man act out his charade for now. When it came to assassination, Aegor couldn't match Jaqen, but in the realm of deception and persuasion, he had his own methods. Turning to Tyrion, Aegor added, "Don't go to bed too early tonight. I might need your help writing a letter." "You really should learn to write yourself." Tyrion grumbled, though he didn't refuse. "Acting as your scribe all day is exhausting. Thanks for your hard work. Those who are capable should do more," Aegor replied with a grin. Whitehu, Hanadan, Ainan Zero. Jeor Mormont, the former lord of Bear Island, had become commander of the Night's Watch after donning the black. For Aegor, he was a leader and a formidable figure, someone to respect, but also someone who required careful handling. Convincing a man like him to change his mind wasn't going to be easy. After all, Commander Mormont had never seen the White Walkers or their overwhelming power. His decision to send a ranger expedition north was perfectly logical. Since there was no fault in his reasoning, Aegor knew he couldn't argue with him through logic alone. "Teska, how should I approach this?" Back at the Albatross Inn with Jaqen and Tyrion, Aegor thought hard and finally came up with a strategy. If reason wouldn't work, he'd take the opposite approach. Start with an unreasonable accusation, grab Mormont's attention, and then use a mix of persuasion and pressure to achieve his goal. The duty of the Night's Watch is to guard the wall, not to protect the Starks. Organizing a large-scale operation to find Benjen Stark not only puts the cart before the horse, but also shows blatant disregard and disrespect for the lives of the other brothers. Tyrion repeated Aegor's words, staring at him as if he'd seen a ghost. The hand holding the pen hovered in mid-air for a long time before he finally asked, "Are you sure you want to write this? This is insubordination." Even if Mormont is reasonable, he can't possibly let this slide. Besides, how do you know your commander-in-chief launched the ranger expedition just to find Benjen Stark? "I don't know," Aegor admitted. "Maybe I misunderstood him. After all, he is the former lord of Bear Island and the commander of the Night's Watch. He must be a magnanimous man. He wouldn't recall me or punish me just because I, a subordinate, accused him of a misunderstanding. And anyway, he's counting on me to provide supplies. If you're so clear on that, why use such an aggressive tone?" Aegor spread his hands. "What do you think he'd think if I presented my arguments nicely, using facts and reason to persuade him not to conduct this large-scale expedition? I don't know. Even though I am short, I can't fit into Mormont's mind. I think he'd definitely think, this guy who's comfortably stationed in King's Landing is hypocritically advising us not to take risks. Just supply the resources and stay out of it," Aegor said with a laugh. then he'd probably skip the rest of the arguments entirely and reply directly, ordering me to prepare the supplies immediately or face recall. You're just making malicious assumptions, but you can't deny it's possible, Aegor said. One has an Orman. On the other hand, if I act like I've misunderstood him and then criticize him under the guise of caring for the Night's Watch, he trailed off, giving Tyrion a knowing look before continuing. You see, people have a weakness. When they hear or see someone accusing them of being wrong, they instinctively focus their attention on it. Their first reaction is to refute the other party. When Commander Mormont sees my accusations, even if he's disdainful, that instinct will likely compel him to keep reading the rest of the letter. Maybe he'll even write back to appease me and explain the real purpose behind organizing this operation. After all, he's counting on me to work harder and fulfill the supply list. You overthink things? Tyrion snorted, though he begrudgingly acknowledged that Igor's logic made some sense. Nodding, he picked up the letter and said, "All right, tell me again. I'll write it down, word for word. But if this backfires, don't blame me." Thus, Aegor dictated while Tyrion wrote. About an hour later, the first official letter from the Night's Watch's inaugural Chief Logistics Officer to the 997th Commander-in-Chief Jeor Mormont was completed. Written by Tyrion Lannister, it was meticulously composed in the neat and elegant script popular in the Westerlands. The letter began with a stern accusation aiming to immediately grab the reader's attention. It was followed by Aegor's speculation and analysis of the situation beyond the wall. Aegor described the circumstances as dire as possible, hoping to alarm the reader. Then he offered his own suggestions. The Night's Watch was currently too weak to act independently. The safest course of action was to stabilize their defenses, gather solid evidence, and then appeal to the rulers of the Seven Kingdoms for aid. Finally, the letter included several concrete plans devised by Aegor. Using his imagination, he outlined methods for capturing whites alive with minimal risk, requiring only small teams of elite Night's Watch brothers. He also promised to provide all the weapons and equipment needed to implement these plans. "Excuse me, Aegor, but your plans seem a little too idealistic. They'd only work if everything went perfectly and nothing went wrong," Tyrion remarked, shaking his head. He had decided, at least for now, not to question the existence of the so-called ghosts beyond the wall. Assuming Aegor wasn't speaking nonsense, Tyrion addressed the practical issues instead. "I've been to the wall myself. The conditions and circumstances there are terrible. The personnel are unevenly trained, and the situation changes constantly. I'm not asking them to follow my plans to the letter. The key lies in the preparation." Aegor smiled faintly. "As long as they agree to the idea of appealing to the rulers of the Seven Kingdoms for help and wait for me to send them the equipment for catching whites and dealing with White Walkers, my goal will be achieved. It takes about a month to travel from King's Landing to the wall, even by sea. By the time the supplies arrive, the most dangerous period will have passed." "What dangerous period?" "Ah, military secrets." The part Aegor didn't share with Tyrion was this. In the original timeline of the Ranger expedition, the Night's Watch stationed themselves at the Fist of the First Man because they believed it was a critical choke point. Mance Raider's 100,000 wildlings were expected to pass through the Milkwater River, and the rugged terrain of the Fist was easy to defend but difficult to attack. Strategically, this high ground was vital. Securing it meant that a few hundred brothers of the Night's Watch could hold off tens of thousands of wildlings. However, instead of wildlings, the Night's Watch faced an army of undead. If the Night's Watch delayed their departure and waited for Aegor's promised equipment and supplies, the wildlings would already be marching south from their assembly point. They would bypass the Fist entirely, and the expeditionary force would lose their first mover advantage. Without seizing the high ground, the Night's Watch wouldn't be trapped on the Fist, surrounded by the dead. This delay could avert their near annihilation. For Aegor, this was the best way for a logistics officer to influence the front line without having direct command authority, control the timing of supplies. If the Night's Watch could capture whites and present them in King's Landing as evidence, that would undoubtedly be the best outcome. Otherwise, saving as many brothers as possible was a worthwhile alternative. Faced with the choice, Aegor ultimately decided to follow his conscience. He couldn't sit by and do nothing while 300 Night's Watch brothers walked to their deaths. Although he wanted to shed his identity as a brother of the Night's Watch and resented being saddled with endless tasks, he still shared a camaraderie with the men at Castle Black. On a personal level, he also admired the dedication and moral character of leaders like Commander Mormont and Maester Aemon. Tisk, I don't care about these so-called military secrets. Tyrion waved dismissively and picked up the letter. Well, that's it. Do you want to add anything else? Let me think. First, request an official certificate of appointment for me as Chief Logistics Officer. Write that I don't want a salary and I'll recruit my own subordinates. All I need is for the Night's Watch to officially recognize my title. Fair enough. What else? Ego thought for a moment and realized sending a letter to the wall was rare, so he might as well include everything. Mention the difficulties I've had recruiting soldiers and explain that I'm planning to recruit temporary Night's Watch. See if Mormont agrees. You are having trouble recruiting soldiers? Tyrion raised an eyebrow. Have you even started recruiting yet? No, but just write it down, Aegor replied nonchalantly. Fine. After organizing his thoughts and slightly embellishing the plan, Igor continued dictating, and Tyrion wrote it down. Oh, one more thing. If you find the bodies of rangers patrolling beyond the wall, don't burn them when you bring them back to Castle Black. Lock them in cages. If they're alive, send them to King's Landing. Tyrion frowned, baffled by the bizarre request, but decided to play along. Anything else? That's all. Oh, no, add one last note for Jon Snow. Tell him Arya asked me to say hello. She's learning swordsmanship with me here in King's Landing and having a great time. Tell him to take care of himself at the wall. Tyrion rolled his eyes. You are impersonating Lady Arya now? Just write it. I'll talk to Arya tomorrow. She'll agree. The letter to the wall had been sent. 1,000 miles away, Igor could do nothing more and had no other way to influence the Night's Watch. He was painfully aware that since he was neither the sole nor the primary source of logistics for the Night's Watch, the so-called logistics impact on the front line would likely be minimal. All he could hope for now was that the raven carrying the letter would reach its destination safely and quickly, and that whoever read it would take the contents to heart. Life in King's Landing went on. After realizing that Arya could serve as his eyes and ears in the city's power core, Aegor began putting more effort into winning her over. Except for matters he absolutely couldn't let her know, he was willing to take her along wherever he went. On the bright side, their master-disciple relationship was growing stronger. On the downside, the closeness also meant that Arya frequently pestered him. If the girl hadn't occasionally dressed up as a proper noble lady or been capable of surprising him with her spirited nature, Aegor might have wondered if all the effort he'd spent just to gain a bit of information was worth it. At times he missed the compulsory education system from the world he came from. Kids without homework, far too terrifying. Though Arya's antics could be troublesome, she was easy to handle if you found the right approach. However, someone else was giving Aegor a headache. Jaqen Hugger. Jaqen hadn't gotten along with Arya upon first meeting her, but more unexpectedly, he hadn't left King's Landing as quickly as Aegor had initially hoped. Instead, he seemed to settle comfortably into the quarters Aegor had arranged for him. Clad in black every day, Jaqen accompanied Aegor to and from work, completed minor tasks at the office when instructed, and occasionally watched over the place in Aegor's absence. Even after Aegor hired another local employee to help with the workload, Jaqen never mentioned leaving. What was the point of having such a skilled assassin and spy around if he wasn't collecting information or killing people on Aegor's behalf? Irritated, Aegor decided to test the situation by bringing Jaqen and Arya together, either to share the burden or to annoy Jaqen enough to make him leave. Akun, I'm busy today, Aegor said, addressing Jaqen with the alias he had given him. Go practice swordplay with Miss Stark. What? Arya immediately frowned in displeasure. No, I only practice with you, master. Don't try to push me off on someone else. You're so useless, Aegor said with mock disdain. It's a waste of my time to practice with you every day. When you've mastered what I've taught and can beat my men, come back and find me. But he doesn't even know how to use a sword. Arya shot back, glaring at Jaqen. Aegor narrowed his eyes and fixed Jaqen with a sharp gaze. You can sneak into the royal library, but you can't handle a little girl? I won't ask about your origins or try to restrict you from staying or leaving, but don't treat me like a fool. If you can't use a sword, then teach her something else. Your only task is to avoid losing to her until I have time to take over again. Jaqen hesitated for a moment before nodding. Someone understands. To avoid creating tension, Igor didn't watch their practice session in the backyard. Arya was sulky at first, but quickly became enthusiastic once she started sparring with her new partner. Watching from a distance, Aegor finally breathed a sigh of relief. If Jachan had both remained in King's Landing for unknown reasons and shamelessly pretended to be useless, Aegor truly wouldn't have known how to deal with him. After a mishap where potential bond buyers came to the office when Aegor wasn't there, he and Tyrion agreed on a stricter schedule for the sales of Night's Watch bonds. On designated days, Aegor would stay in the office from morning to night while Tyrion sought out customers. During other times, Aegor left the office in the care of his employees and focused on other matters, such as supervising the siblings' progress on papermaking, refining their processes, urging the mining of obsidian, and purchasing supplies for the Night's Watch. Summer in King's Landing remained as hot and foul-smelling as ever. Without the interference of Catelyn Tully or Pater Baelish, the city's political landscape seemed duller than the original plot. The king spent his days drinking, feasting, and indulging in every vice imaginable. Author's note: this chapter peels back the myth of honor and exposes the quiet machinery behind it. Ned Stark was not foolish, only shaped for a role fate never meant him to play. In a world ruled by games and blood, even virtue can become a carefully misplaced piece.
The queen nervously continued her incestuous affair with her brother, while the hand of the king fretted over the mystery of Jon Arryn's death and the increasingly worrisome rumors spreading through the city. Beneath this uneasy calm, however, the first batch of Night's Watch bonds had been issued, and paper-making technology had quietly progressed. On Dragonstone, the first shipment of obsidian mined from the ancient quarries was loaded onto a ship, packed tightly alongside the supplies Aegor had purchased for his white capturing plan. Meanwhile, in a small workshop, the first sheets of plant fiber paper with practical use in Westeros, and perhaps the entire A Song of Ice and Fire world were finally produced. This was a historic moment, especially for the small group of individuals hopping to make their fortunes with the new invention. Aegor, Tyrion, the siblings, and an excited Arya gathered in the workshop to inspect the results. From appearances alone, the paper in front of Aegor, despite its slightly grayish-yellow color and uneven edges, resembled the low-quality, pirated books or ghost money he had seen in his past life. He picked up a sheet to test it, folding and rolling it. It was flexible enough. Pulling at it with some force, he found that it deformed slightly without tearing. The next test was writing on it. "Bring me a pen," Aegor ordered. Nina hurried to fetch pen and ink, but Arya snatched them up. "I'll write on it," she declared excitedly. Aegor sighed, a hint of affection creeping into his voice. "All right, I'll let you be the first." Of course, Arya wasn't really the first to test the paper. The siblings wouldn't have dared to summon Aegor and Tyrion without conducting their own experiments. Nonetheless, Arya eagerly dipped the pen in ink and wrote her name, Arya Stark. Beneath it, she added a drawing of a cloud, a tree, and a stick figure. The room grew silent as the siblings watched Aegor and Tyrion nervously. Tyrion gave Aegor a questioning glance. "Well," Aegor prompted. "What?" Tyrion shrugged. "Aren't you the one in charge of printing? Do you think this paper can be used for printing?" Tyrion studied Arya's scribbles and doodles for a moment, then stroked his chin thoughtfully. "I think it'll work." "Good." Aegor nodded decisively. "You know, what's the cost of producing this paper?" "The raw material cost is negligible," Nina replied. "The main expenses are equipment, chemicals, dyes, fuel, and labor. Exclude the equipment and venue. Give me a rough number for production alone. About 10 copper coins per sheet." "Very good." Aegor began calculating in his head. "After mass production, even factoring in equipment and rent, the cost will decrease further. As the process improves, we'll drive that number even lower." Turning to Tyrion, he asked, "How much does parchment cost on the market right now?" 2 months ago, Tyrion wouldn't have known, but he had since done his research. For a sheet this size, more than a silver stag, maybe even a silver moon for higher quality. "Then it's clear." Aegor exhaled deeply. "Even without further improvements, our paper costs a fraction of parchment." He paused and smiled. "Now the fun begins. To mark this historic moment, let's give this paper a name." Nina spoke first. "Master Aegor made the greatest contribution to its creation. Let's call it West Paper." "Haha, I don't deserve all the credit." "No, it should be Arya Paper," Arya chimed in. "Look, my name is already on it." Amid the laughter, Tyrion raised his hand. Let me be the boss this time. I say we call it Night's Watch paper. Not only does it honor the sponsor of its development, but it also doubles as free advertising for our bonds. Although they were excited, there were more pressing concerns than nomming the paper, specifically how to quickly commercialize their innovation. In other words, how to make money from it as soon as possible. The first priority is attracting customers. Aegor motioned for everyone to quiet down. First, let's calculate. After trimming off the irregular and useless edges of the raw paper, how many uniform rectangles can we produce? The answer wasn't difficult to determine. Aegor folded a sample sheet himself and soon reached a conclusion. A single raw sheet could be divided into 6 pieces slightly larger than A4 paper with minimal waste. However, considering the size of the printing plates and the ergonomic preferences for books, it should actually be halved again. That meant one sheet of raw paper could ultimately yield 12 sheets of a practical size, ideal for printing text and binding into books or pamphlets. How many sheets of raw paper can the workshop produce in a single day? Nina licked her lips, pausing to think. Hard to say. The process from raw materials to finished paper requires time and effort. Adding lime, other powders, and firing can speed things up. If we hire more people, buy better equipment, and establish a steady cycle for all the steps, we could increase production significantly. Then expand as quickly as possible, Aegor suggested after a moment of thought. Recruit locals you trust. Divide the paper-making process into several distinct steps with each worker specializing in a specific task. Essentially, create an assembly line. This will not only speed up production but also make it harder for anyone to learn the entire process by poaching workers. To steal the technique, they'd have to recruit almost everyone on the production line, which would be impossible to do discreetly. Assembly line. Nina bit her lip, considered it, and quickly grasped the concept. And what happens if they poach your workers openly? Tyrion shrugged. It's not a particularly complex process. Once production scales up, it'll be impossible to stop others from copying it. True, Aegor admitted. That's why we need to move quickly. Before competitors start popping up, we must establish partnerships with as many wealthy patrons as possible to minimize their potential influence and dominate the market. Lean back, his tone matter of fact. In a world without intellectual property rights, expecting to monopolize the industry was naive. Aegor knew better than to waste time on fruitless endeavors. First, collect the paper we already have and print a copy of the 7-pointed Star Bible. Take it to churches, bookstores, and general stores to showcase it and try to negotiate some orders. Tyrion, you're good at that sort of thing, so I'll leave it to you. Why does everyone assume I'm good at this? You're certainly better than I am, Aegor quipped with a sly grin. He wasn't sure about Tyrion's business acumen, but as a member of the Lannister family, he was bound to have connections and charm. Making full use of everyone's abilities and influence was crucial in starting a business. Also, we need to start recruiting more workers to ease the burden. Don't sit idle while we're waiting on major orders. Keep working and refining the production process. Send all finished paper to the printing press and have it made into calendars. If people want them, we'll sell them wholesale. If no one does give them to me, I'll distribute them through the Night's Watch office as gifts. Every visitor will get a monthly calendar, and anyone who buys bonds will receive a year's worth. For those who invest in our venture, their homes will always be supplied with Night's Watch calendars. Not a bad idea, Tyrion remarked approvingly. Calendars weren't a new concept. In a world where seasons were irregular, significant dates like major festivals were recorded in the royal calendar, issued by the Citadel and approved by the Iron Throne. However, paper was a luxury item, and anything made from it was rare. Wealthy officials who needed to keep track of time always had a calendar, but ordinary city folk often shared one among several households, or even an entire street. In rural villages, there might be only one for everyone. As a non-essential luxury, paper calendars were a rarity. Using them as gifts was cost-effective yet impressive, making it a perfect choice. In the workshop, Aegor naturally fell into the role of leader. The others didn't seem to mind. In fact, they often deferred to him. After assigning tasks, he suddenly remembered something else. Of course, I won't just sit back and do nothing. I'll start gathering writers to create some adventure novels. Once we've ramped up our paper-making and printing, we'll start publishing books. Master, you've told me so many stories about your adventures before coming to Westeros. Those alone could fill a book, Arya said. Aegor was about to tousle her hair to dismiss her comment, but then he paused. Why hadn't he thought of that? The girl had a point. To avoid slipping up when recounting his fabricated adventures, he'd been jotting down notes every night, outlines of incredible tales that could easily rival world-class adventure stories like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Treasure Island, The Adventures of Robinson Crusoe, or Around the World in 80 Days. If he polished these outlines and handed them to a skilled writer or bard to refine, he could pass them off as his own biography of daring escapades. The sales potential was enormous. These stories had universal appeal, requiring no special literary knowledge to enjoy. Perhaps Aegor thought this could even enhance the Night's Watch's public image. Maybe he should become an icon of sorts. He rarely acknowledged Arya's insights, but this time he gave her a rare compliment. Good idea. Tyrion's eyes gleamed with mischief as he leaned closer to Aegor and whispered, Don't forget one more thing. It won't be respectable enough for the stage, but the public will love it. What are you talking about? Arya demanded, her sharp ears picking up the whisper. Aegor's mind raced. Something scandalous yet marketable, of course. A little yellow book risque stories. There were no censors in Westeros after all. He chuckled inwardly but reassured Arya, don't worry, I'll get you a book when the time comes. Would it be a bad influence on the child? Possibly. But considering how little time Eddard Stark had spent raising her, Aegor figured he was doing more than enough. With everything discussed, the only thing left was for everyone to carry out their tasks. The business was ready to begin in earnest. There's one last matter, Aegor said, remembering his earlier promise. This time he had discussed it with Tyrion beforehand. Previously I mentioned giving you a tenth of the profits from the paper mill. That was unclear and incomplete, so here's what I'll do. Half of this workshop will be yours, not just the profits but the ownership. When we have enough funds, I'll buy the yard outright to serve as your permanent workspace and home. This is my acknowledgement of your contributions to the process and your innovations. However, in exchange you cannot quit or start your own business without my permission. If you have new ideas or inventions, you must report them to the Night's Watch first. If you agree, one of you can come back to the Night's Watch office with me to sign the agreement today. Thank you, sir. Neil quickly replied, surprising everyone with his decisiveness. Let Nina sign the agreement. The setting sun cast deep patches of orange and crimson light over the cobbled streets of King's Landing. Aegor, Tyrion, and Arya, along with the red-cloaked and grey-cloaked guards representing the Lannister and Stark families, walked out of the workshop, chatting and laughing as they led their horses back toward the inn. After more than a month together, these individuals hailing from different corners of the world and unlikely to have crossed paths otherwise had become surprisingly familiar with one another. Even Tyrion's two servants could now exchange friendly nods and light-hearted greetings with the Stark nanny, who came to pick Arya up from time to time, sometimes lingering for a casual chat. Aegor walked at ease. He had now spent over a month in King's Landing, and under Tyrion's diligent efforts, nearly 2,000 gold dragons worth of Night's Watch bonds had been sold. Without the allure of extraordinary returns typical of Ponzi schemes, the sales had been slow. Furthermore, Westeros had no established concept of investment or financial management, so not a single bond purchase had come from someone who approached them on their own initiative. Even among Tyrion's connections, with the slight exception of Jaime Lannister, most had only purchased the minimum bond amount of 100 gold dragons, more as a favor than anything else. However, this slow and steady pace did have its advantages. Most buyers viewed their purchase as a gesture of goodwill toward Tyrion, believing that the Lannisters would ultimately ensure the return of their investment, however small. Under such circumstances, Aegor had little reason to fear a sudden large-scale demand for repayment. 2,000 gold dragons might not seem like a fortune, but with Tyrion's own wealth added to the mix, and in the absence of rebellion or costly public works, it was a significant sum, capable of achieving much. For instance, they had already purchased a large piece of land outside the city, acquired equipment, and hired workers to construct a substantial workshop for papermaking and printing. Or perhaps factory would be a more accurate term. With this in place, they had secured dominance over the production and trade of Bibles, calendars, and novels within King's Landing and the surrounding crownlands. If Tyrion could attract additional investment, the business could expand further while still maintaining a solid financial cushion for emergencies. The initial goal of establishing a foothold in King's Landing had been achieved. From here, it was a question of how much profit could be made and how far this partnership with Tyrion could go. As Arya's nominal master, Aegor had made several attempts to civilize the girl, to have her dress more like a proper young lady, refrain from swearing or acting rudely, and understand the importance of decorum. Unfortunately, he hadn't managed to curb her habit of interrupting conversations to share her own opinions. At this moment, Aegor wasn't sure what she had said to Tyrion, but the two of them were laughing and exchanging jokes again. The sight was strangely harmonious, an older man and a young girl, one a Lannister and the other a Stark, both roughly the same height, unexpectedly hitting it off. In the original course of events, they would have met only briefly, before diverging onto vastly different paths. Yet thanks to the disruption caused by Aegor's arrival, they had encountered each other at the Night's Watch office, and somehow formed a rare bond between two rival families. If not for the significant age gap, and if Aegor didn't see them every day to know otherwise, he might have suspected that these two were trying to act out a melodramatic tale of love bridging a family feud. He turned his head slightly, remembering another person trailing behind him, Nina. She followed quietly, head bowed, looking a little shy. Having spent his days with individuals like Tyrion and Arya, one of whom treated him as a partner while the other called him master, Aegor was aware that outsiders might see him as someone important. This naturally left an impression on others, who often reacted with awe or nervousness. It was human nature. Nina was no exception. The girl was intelligent, literate, and resourceful. Aegor decided to break the awkward atmosphere and draw her into conversation. Nina, tell me, he asked casually, do you or your brother have any ideas on how we could reduce costs? Ah, she exclaimed softly, startled by the sudden question. She glanced up briefly before lowering her eyes again. I have some thoughts, but I haven't tested them yet. I'm not sure if they'll work. Aegor was certain he hadn't imagined it. Her cheeks seemed to flush red. He was no stranger to women. If not for his unexpected journey to this world, he might have already become a father. In that moment it clicked, this wasn't just the nervousness of speaking to someone important. No, this was the kind of flustered panic that came from being near someone she secretly admired. Could Tyrion's teasing have been right? Was this girl truly interested in him? It wasn't impossible. While Aegor himself was a common soldier, his time in King's Landing had been spent in meetings with powerful individuals. The Hand of the King, noble knights introduced by Tyrion, and even members of the royal court. His efforts to cultivate a polished image had paid off. Apart from his insistence on wearing black, his clothing, manners, and overall demeanor were likely more refined than those of many impoverished nobles. In Nina's eyes, he wasn't just a benefactor, he was her employer, a man of means and influence. In a society like Westeros, where life was harsh and ambition often came second to survival, it wasn't surprising that a young girl might develop feelings for someone like him. Aegor let out a faint, self-deprecating smile. Before arriving here, his life had been modest. While he had no trouble finding a partner, he had never experienced the sensation of being openly admired. "Well," he said gently, "ideas don't have to be perfect. Share them with me and I'll help refine them." As Nina explained her thoughts on improving paper-making efficiency, Aegor listened intently, though some of her suggestions went beyond his understanding. He took the opportunity to study her more closely. The bright eyes that had first caught his attention needed no further praise. But even setting those aside, her features had a quiet beauty. Soft, rosy skin, delicate dimples that appeared when she spoke, long lashes, and a slender figure hidden beneath her modest clothing. She was like a newly blossomed lotus flower, pure, untainted, and full of potential. Nina wasn't just pretty, she was capable, literate, and inventive, a rarity in the harsh world of Westeros. While noblewomen often possessed beauty, they rarely combined it with intelligence and practicality. For a fleeting moment, Aegor considered the possibility of keeping her close, not just as an employee but as something more. The thought was quickly dismissed. He wasn't foolish enough to jeopardize his work or her future over fleeting temptation. Still, it didn't hurt to maintain a friendly rapport. Smiling, he encouraged her, "Don't worry about costs. Try what you think will work. Don't be afraid of failure." Gradually, Nina's shyness faded. As they chatted, she began to relax, even sneaking glances at Aegor when she thought he wasn't looking. By the time they arrived at the Night's Watch office, Nina was in much higher spirits. Though she wasn't a financial investor, Aegor and Tyrion intended to sign a formal investment certificate with her as they would with future partners. If they wanted to retain capable people, they needed to show sincerity. But before they could proceed, a staff member approached. "Sir, a letter has arrived from the Lord Commander." That was fast. It had only been a dozen days since they'd sent the last letter. Taking the envelope, Aegor noted that the seal had already been broken. Was it the work of Maester Pycelle, responsible for handling letters in King's Landing? Or had Jaqen opened it, ever the silent spy lurking in the shadows? Aegor's gaze briefly flicked to the Braavosi man, who sat nearby feigning innocence before he unfolded the letter. As long as it didn't summon him back to the wall, he could handle whatever it said. After reading for a few seconds, Aegor raised his head, a knowing smile spreading across his face. "What news is so delightful?" Tyrion asked, unimpressed. Having written the original letter himself, he had a good idea of the response. "Did Mormont postpone the northern expedition and explain why?" Aegor nodded, still grinning. "Did they confirm your position as chief logistics officer?" Another nod, the grin widening. "Did they finally capture one of those whites?" "Not quite, but they're trying," Aegor replied, setting the letter aside. Though it contained a minor piece of troubling news, he already had a plan to address it. "Enough about that. Let's head inside and sign the investment certificate." The partial bad news in the letter was that while Mormont approved the idea of recruiting temporary guards for the wall, he didn't fully accept the plan's more subtle intentions.
Author's note: this chapter marks the quiet birth of a revolution, not with swords, but with paper and ink. While kings and queens drown in secrets, Aegor planned something far more dangerous, ideas that can be copied, sold, and remembered. In Westeros, the sharpest weapon is no longer Valyrian steel, it's the written word.
The Lord Commander of the Night's Watch placed specific restrictions on Aegor's proposal. Anyone recruited to temporarily assist at the wall, and intending to return to civilian life after a few years, could not be called a member of the Night's Watch unless they swore the official oath. Not only that, they couldn't undergo formal training at Castle Black like ordinary recruits. They had to arrive at the wall as mercenaries, rather than sworn brothers, and immediately contribute to its defense. In summary, the recruits Aegor brought in were barred from becoming fully integrated members of the Night's Watch, and they had to be ready to take on military tasks as soon as they reached the wall. Under these restrictions, Aegor was left with two options: hire professional mercenaries or train recruits himself. The first option was appealing. In this era, mercenaries were professional soldiers, their combat effectiveness almost guaranteed. However, mercenaries came with high costs. Employing them made sense only for those with deep pockets like the Lannisters, or in conflicts where spoils of war could cover their wages and pensions. For Aegor and the Night's Watch, who faced the Wildlings and the White Walkers, two types of enemies who offered no financial return even in victory, this was a problem. Defeating wildlings might yield some spoils, but White Walkers left nothing of value behind. Without any means to fight to support the war, eager new mercenaries, always pragmatic, would demand steep upfront payments. While a few thousand gold dragons was a significant amount, enough to start a business, it would barely make a dent if funneled into mercenary wages. Aegor simply couldn't afford that luxury right now. His only viable option was to train recruits himself. What a nuisance, Aegor frowned. Did Mormont see through his plan to gradually dilute the Night's Watch with outside recruits to increase his influence? Or was it simply about maintaining the purity of the Night's Watch as a brotherhood? Or perhaps it wasn't that complicated at all. Maybe Mormont just wanted to add another burden to keep him busy and productive while stationed in King's Landing. Whatever the reasoning, the answer didn't matter. The real question was how to handle the situation. Aegor wasn't overly concerned. He had anticipated this possibility. If the Night's Watch differentiated between their own men and outside foreign aid, then his original plan to gain influence and control might stall. However, on the flip side, training his own recruits in King's Landing would give him tighter control over the foreign aid he brought in, as well as a closer relationship with them. While this approach would cost more and require greater effort, the benefits of direct oversight could potentially outweigh the drawbacks. Attached to the back of the letter was a small note which Aegor handed to Arya. It was a message from Jon. The moment Arya read it, she beamed with joy, nearly letting out a squeal. She was too thrilled to notice Aegor shaking his head and sighing inwardly. Poor Jon, stuck in that bleak place like Castle Black, reduced to writing letters just to convince his little sister he was living a fulfilling life. Leaving Arya to her note, Aegor took Nina into the inner room. Fully prepared, he quickly signed the world's first Night's Watch asset investment certificate with Tyrion's assistance. Handing the document to Nina, he praised her and encouraged her, telling her she could always come to him directly if she encountered trouble. With this, the papermaking project was officially concluded. According to routine, he should have sent Arya back to the Red Keep, accompanied Tyrion to his inn, and then escorted Nina home. After a few such visits, familiarity with Nina's family would make retrieving her for future work easier. But after some thought, Aegor decided against it. Instead, he called for Jaqen. "Akon, escort Miss Nina home. Once you've done that, head back to the inn and rest. I'll lock up here." "I have too many responsibilities right now," Aegor thought. Flirting with a girl like Nina, barely out of childhood and still inexperienced, would be irresponsible for both her and myself. Discipline was paramount in a world full of dangers and temptations. Suppressing the distractions caused by his hormones, Aegor shifted his focus to two pressing matters. First, training his recruits in King's Landing. Second, finding alternative ways to strengthen his influence and authority within the Night's Watch, particularly as a chief logistics officer stationed far from the Wall. After all, if the foreign aid he brought in was excluded from votes or decision-making, his influence might be diminished. Training troops in King's Landing, the capital of the Seven Kingdoms, was a particularly sensitive endeavor. It was akin to trying to establish a private militia under the king's nose, an act that could provoke suspicion and conflict. Even with the backing of Eddard Stark, the Hand of the King, the endeavor wouldn't be smooth sailing. Aegor would need a legitimate reason. The solution to the first problem came to him quickly. Since he was opening a factory, it would naturally require security guards to protect the premises. He could recruit workers under the pretext of hiring factory guards, train them collectively, and when the time came, offer double salaries to those willing to head north to the Wall. As for the second issue, after mulling it over, Aegor realized he'd fallen into the trap of relying too much on trickery. Having seen success with deception and schemes, his first instinct was to approach every problem with those tools. But this situation was different. He was a sworn brother of the Night's Watch and had officially been recognized as its chief logistics officer. Although his influence was currently limited, practically non-existent, save for Jaqen's shadowy presence, these titles still carried weight. They granted him real authority within the organization, a foundation he could build upon. The solution wasn't convoluted. To increase his influence, he simply needed to perform his duties well. If he ensured the Night's Watch had adequate food, warm clothing, and sufficient weapons, and made it clear to the Brothers in Black that these improvements were thanks to his efforts, his reputation would naturally rise. He just had to ensure that no other officer took credit for his work. With visible, tangible results, his standing within the Night's Watch would grow organically. Sometimes an open and honest effort could accomplish more than any hidden scheme, and in the end, money could solve most problems. Finally, able to relax his mind, Aegor let out a breath. The next step was to select a site for the factory and begin preparations to establish what he dubbed the Night's Watch Logistics and Security Department. The Seven-Pointed Star Bible is the primary scripture of the Faith of the Seven. It is divided into 7 gospel chapters, each corresponding to one of the 7 faces of God. The official version contains over 300,000 words, and each printed copy with illustrations spans hundreds of pages. Normally, purchasing a book made of parchment, painstakingly copied and painted by hand, costs at least 1 gold dragon. Even then, it's typically out of stock and must be custom ordered. no one has the resources or the patience to produce large quantities and wait for buyers. When the first 7-pointed star Bible printed and bound on plant fiber paper was completed, Tyrion personally brought the sample to the church to promote it. With his status and persuasive charm, he secured the first major order. The church requested 1,000 copies at the price of 30 silver stags each, as well as an additional 10,000 brochures and images with content provided by the church, priced at 1 silver stag per copy. In addition to this, Tyrion's salesmen managed to secure small orders from merchants and shopkeepers. By the time the factory began production, the accumulated orders, many of which were tentative as customers tested the appeal of this new product, amounted to hundreds of gold dragons. Because of the Lannister name, some smaller clients even paid in advance. The first set of printing plates was already complete. Seeing the demand surge not falter, Aegor wisely ordered the production of a second set. The above results only account for the 7-pointed star Bible. Calendar sales added sporadic orders worth dozens of gold dragons. Meanwhile, preparations for novels and adult material were also in full swing. Unfortunately, while finding writers for novels was relatively simple, Aegor had yet to locate someone skilled in crafting risque content. This realization left him feeling slightly uneasy. If no one else could produce it, he might have to step in himself. Writing explicit content wouldn't be difficult, he had the experience for it, but illustrations were another matter. Without cameras or computers, all images had to be drawn by hand. Still, it was too early to dwell on such concerns. As the saying went, the path would reveal itself when the mountain was reached. After much discussion, the factory was finally established outside the southwest walls of King's Landing, slightly upstream from the bustling ports along the Blackwater River and south of the tourney grounds. There were several reasons for this choice. The area was spacious and relatively clean. Its proximity to the river allowed easy access to water for production as well as a place to discharge waste. Additionally, the river could potentially provide water power. The location was close to Blackwater Bay, King's Gate, and major roads, making transportation convenient. Lastly, the poor population living around the city walls offered a steady source of cheap labor. After several days of map studies and on-site inspections, Aegor and Tyrion finally settled on this open space. It had once been farmland, located a few miles outside King's Gate, only a few hundred yards from the main road and close to the Blackwater River. Logically, a location so close to King's Landing and on the southern bank of the Blackwater should have been highly coveted. However, this wasn't the modern world Aegor had left behind, filled with savvy speculators. In this era, all the land around King's Landing was technically the personal property of King Robert, and there was one major factor devaluing such locations. Land outside the city walls wasn't protected and was considered less desirable. In the original story, even the priciest area outside King's Landing's walls, Blackwater Port near the Mud Gate, was completely leveled during the War of the Five Kings. Stannis' forces had approached by sea and land, and Tyrion, leading the city's defense, ordered the area demolished to prevent it from being used as a staging ground for an attack. The location chosen by Aegor and Tyrion was farther west from that bustling port area, where the Blackwater Bay narrowed into the Blackwater River. The riverbanks were steep and the water fast-moving, making the area unsuitable for merchant ships. As a result, the land was deemed worthless by traders. After the surrounding trees were cut down, the space had been left idle, eventually being occupied by a handful of farmers who planted vegetables, fruits, and melons. Arya adored her swordsmanship instructor, as her father had grown slightly fonder of Aegor because of his daughter's enthusiasm. As the hand of the king and warden of the north, End was also intrigued by Aegor's idea of developing the Night's Watch's industry in King's Landing. Without much effort, the chief logistics officer was granted use of the land from the hand himself. All Aegor needed to do was compensate the farmers for the crops they had planted. He didn't even have to pay rent to the Iron Throne. Perfect. After hearing a reliable construction team and creating detailed plans, the Night's Watch began building their first southern stronghold. That same day, after inspecting the site, Aegor and Tyrion returned to King's Landing together. Maybe I should move out there someday, Tyrion mused. It's not just bigger, it doesn't reek like the city. It's a good place, Aegor agreed, but it's far from the brothels. As more people move into the industrial area, brothels will follow naturally, Aegor added with a chuckle. Who knows, someday the Night's Watch might even have brothels of its own out there. At the mention of brothels, Aegor couldn't help but worry about Tyrion. Because of his interference, the dwarf had never crossed paths with she. While Aegor considered this a good thing, Tyrion wasn't getting any younger, and Aegor wondered if he'd ever find true love. Of course, the brothels meant for workers wouldn't be fit for a noble Lannister. You should consider keeping one just for yourself. I like to change my tastes occasionally, Tyrion quipped, ignoring the joke. But what about your little apprentice? She's the Hand's daughter. How could she travel more than 10 miles every day just to take lessons from you? Having Arya around is an asset. Even if you don't factor in personal reasons, you can't abandon her. True, Aegor nodded. Arya's presence was invaluable. That was just idle talk. I'll stay in the city for now. But you did give me an idea, Tyrion said, quickly pivoting. Building the factory is one thing, but providing services to workers is another. We could open canteens, shops, brothels, even gambling houses right next to the factory. Then, restrict workers from leaving during work hours and ensure they can only spend their money on site. That way, we can pay them higher wages, knowing they'll spend part of it back on us. It'll keep the capital flowing steadily. Aegor gave Tyrion a sideways glance. That's diabolical. You deserve your nickname, Little Demon. I learned it from you, Tyrion shot back, grinning. If I'm the little demon, you're the big demon. I just want money. You want to send these people to the wall to fight wildlings and White Walkers. That's throwing lives away. What started as a joke suddenly felt heavy. Aegor's face darkened. Someone has to do it. Yes, Tyrion admitted, realizing he had struck a nerve. Someone does have to do it. Hopping to lighten the mood, he added, we'll just have to pay them handsomely for it. Absolutely, Aegor agreed. While he didn't want to face such dangers himself, he wanted to reward those brave enough to stand against humanity's enemies. The conversation shifted. Tyrion mentioned progress in attracting investors. A young noble living in King's Landing had shown interest and informed his family. A senior member of the noble house was due to arrive within 2 days to visit the factory. If all went well, their first large investment was within reach. Riding side by side, the two made their way back into the city, bypassing Vicenia's Hill, traveling along Iron Street and passing the Great Sept of Baelor. That's when Aegor noticed an unusual building. He had seen it before on his first day in King's Landing, but the city's stench and his disorientation as a newcomer had drowned out any curiosity. Now, with a better understanding of the city, the building's incongruity stood out even more. It was grand, like a large hotel, taller than the surrounding structures but smaller than the Great Sept located in the heart of the city. It appeared abandoned, its doors were shut, its windows broken and unrepaired. What's that building for? Aegor asked. Tyrion glanced up. That, the Alchemist's Guild Hall. You must have heard of pyromancers and wildfire, Tyrion replied with a shrug. Seeing Aegor pull the reins to halt his horse, Tyrion sighed and stopped as well, along with his 2 guards, Jack and Morris. What's wrong? That doesn't sound fun. Aegor turned back, curiosity piqued. If I wanted to visit, could I go inside? Of course, it's not hard to get in, Tyrion said. Pyromancers were once the favorites of the Targaryens, but now they've fallen so low that anyone with a bit of coin can walk in and sneer at them. If it weren't for all the wildfire stockpiled underground, this building would have been torn down long ago. The people inside, though, well, they're half crazy, maybe half pitiful. Imagine falling from the heavens straight into hell. That's what their lives are like. Let's go take a look, Aegor decided. Tyrion frowned, puzzled by the sudden interest, but he was already used to Aegor's unpredictable nature. Without further questions, he climbed down from his special saddle with some difficulty, standing beside Aegor along with the 2 servants. How do we get inside? Through the main door, Tyrion answered matter-of-factly. Aegor rolled his eyes. The door shut, then knocked, Tyrion said flatly. Was it really that simple? Morris stayed behind to watch the horses while the other 3 ascended the steps and knocked on the wooden door, which looked as though it hadn't been opened in decades. To their surprise, the response was almost immediate. Far faster than expected, the door creaked open, revealing an old man with a shifty demeanor, his face lined with suspicion. He looked even more disreputable than Will. What do you want? Buying that substance? Tyrion patted his purse, letting the golden dragons and silver stags inside jingle audibly. Hearing this, the old man opened the door wider. Come in then. What are you doing wearing so little? What was that supposed to mean? Aegor frowned but refrained from asking, trusting Tyrion's confidence as they followed the old man inside. However, he soon realized something was off. They weren't going upstairs as he expected, but descending into the lower levels. What's your name? Tyrion asked their guide. Call me Wisdom Halling, the old man said proudly. How much do you want? Ask my friend here, Tyrion said, gesturing to Aegor. He's curious about wildfire. How much does it cost? Aegor's mind was a whirlwind. Who was he? Where was he, and what was he doing? Right, he was now Aegor West, chief logistics officer of the Night's Watch, standing in the hall of the Alchemist's Guild trying to learn about wildfire. Yet the casual tone of their conversation unsettled him. Something as dangerous as wildfire explosives essentially was being discussed as if it were a fine wine available for casual purchase. Ah, wearing black, I see. Someone in your family died. It's a good idea to use this stuff to cremate the body, Halling said with a morbid grin. Aegor's face darkened. I'm a Night's Watchman, that's none of your business. Just explain this substance to me. Fine, you curious squirrels always have so many questions, Halling muttered before turning his attention back to Tyrion. But if I explain, you must buy at least 10 silver stags worth. Do you know who I am? Tyrion asked, raising an eyebrow. My family has enough gold to buy the entire Alchemist's Guild. Halling stared at Tyrion for a long moment, visibly unsure. From his reaction, Aegor could tell the old man genuinely didn't recognize Tyrion or the Lannister name. Still, Tyrion's confidence and commanding aura seemed to intimidate him enough. Without further complaints, Halling grabbed an oil lamp from the wall and began leading them down a dark, narrow staircase. Do you know about dragons? Halling began dramatically as they descended. Those terrifying creatures with wings that darken the sky, able to burn the world with their breath. Do you know where their fire comes from? Magic, Aegor guessed. No, it's an organ in their chest, Halling said, shaking his head. This organ secretes a mystical liquid. When the dragon breathes fire, the liquid is compressed, sprayed out, and ignited by a small spark of magic. That's how dragon fire is made. What does this have to do with wildfire? Is it the same substance harvested from dragons? Aegor asked, frowning. A grim thought crossed his mind. Was the Alchemists Guild responsible for the extinction of dragons, harvesting them for wildfire production? Of course, the idea was absurd. Even if dragons produce such a substance, humans would have found a more sustainable way to extract it, like milking a bear for bile. His real concern was something else. How could such a dangerous and vital military weapon be treated so casually, sold like common merchandise? Judging by Halene's humble demeanor, wildfire wasn't even in high demand. No, Halene replied. It's not harvested from dragons, it was inspired by them. With a combination of magic and technology, we managed to create it ourselves. Then just call it wildfire, Aegor snapped, growing irritated. Why all this cryptic talk about that substance? It's ridiculous. Wildfire is a name used by laymen, Halene huffed indignantly.
Author's note: this chapter shifts from quiet commerce to controlled force, where logistics become power and paper gives way to fire. Aegor learns that authority isn't seized through schemes alone, but earned through visible results and dangerous choices. And in the depths of King's Landing, a green flame stirs, waiting for the wrong hand.
It's not wild, it can be controlled, with proper safety precautions and mastery of fire magic. You know fire magic, Tyrion interrupted, his tone dripping with skepticism. If wildfire were truly controllable, the Targaryens would still sit on the Iron Throne. Instead, your substance has been devalued to the point that no one wants it. Halene faltered, stammering a weak response. He fell silent and continued, leading them deeper underground. The temperature dropped sharply as they descended. By the time they reached the bottom, Aegor was shivering. It felt as though the outside temperature of 30 degrees had plummeted to 10 in the damp, stone-walled cellar. The walls were coated with saltpeter, and the only light came from the sealed iron bar oil lamp Dake carried. Finally, they arrived at a heavy, reinforced door. Handing the lamp to Aegor, Halene produced a key and unlocked it. Don't come inside, Halene warned sharply. Stay by the door. The light and temperature could destabilize the substance. Aegor froze, carefully holding the oil lamp at arm's length. He was beginning to understand why wildfire wasn't widely used. If it was this volatile, how could anyone handle it safely? Peering inside, he saw rows of shelves lined with bright red ceramic jars, each shaped like a plump grapefruit. Come help me, Halene called, motioning for the group to approach. Aegor passed the lamp to Jack and cautiously stepped forward. Taking a jar from the shelf, Halene poured its contents into a small vial. Under the faint light, the liquid appeared dark green with a texture resembling thick honey. Don't touch it, even your body heat could destabilize it. Body heat can ignite it. Aegor nearly dropped the jar in alarm. Not quite, at least there are no recorded cases of that happening, Halene admitted sheepishly. But the older it gets, the more unstable it becomes, better safe than sorry. Before long, the small vial, slightly larger than a bottle of ale, was filled. Halene insisted the amount was worth more than 10 silver stags, but claimed the extra was a gift. After paying, Aegor carefully stored the vial according to Halene's instructions. I'm very interested in this, Aegor said as he handed Halene a card. If you're free, visit me at the Night's Watch office in the next 2 days. It's across from the east camp of the King's Landing garrison. We can discuss a larger deal. Big business. Tyrion shivered from the cold, rubbing his short arms as he climbed the stairs quickly. You mean the wildfire stored below? Sorry, but that's not happening. The only reason the king hasn't reclaimed this building for other uses is that the wildfire stockpiled beneath it is too dangerous. Most of the experts who knew how to handle it properly either died in the war or disappeared, so the few remaining pyromancers have been left here to keep watch. Technically speaking, the little deal we just made was illegal, but Robert doesn't care enough to put a stop to it. But if you're thinking of moving all the wildfire out and transporting it to the wall for military use, forget it. That's absolutely impossible. It certainly was. Aegor suspected that wildfire was likely some volatile oil mixed with white phosphorus or other phosphorus compounds, highly flammable with an extremely low flash point. The longer it sat in storage, the more the oil evaporated, leaving behind a higher concentration of phosphorus residue, making it even more prone to combustion. Without precise safety measures, transporting such a substance over long distances was out of the question. Is that so? Aegor turned to the pyromancer. That's correct. Now that he had been paid 10 silver stags, Halene looked considerably friendlier. The wise King Robert has decreed that the wildfire below must be kept under constant guard and that not a single jar may leave the cellar. Not a single jar, so what, we just smuggle them out one at a time instead? Tyrion quipped sarcastically. No, that's not. It doesn't matter, Aegor cut in before Halene could flounder further. I'm not interested in the wildfire already stored here. What I want is the method to produce it. Tell me, are you still making new batches or are you only selling off the old stock? Impossible. Halene's demeanor changed instantly. His eyes widened and he stiffened as if insulted. The process of crafting wildfire is the most closely guarded secret of the Alchemists Guild. No amount of gold could buy that knowledge. No amount of gold? Aegor smirked but let the comment slide. Instead, he shook his head. When I say I want wildfire to be made, I don't mean you should hand over the formula or reveal the production process. I mean I want you to make it for me, do you understand? Serve you. Answer me now, can I see the production process, or at least the place where it's made? Halline hesitated for a moment but eventually nodded. That can be arranged. He led them back upstairs, and as soon as they stepped onto the ground floor, the warmth of the air made them exhale in relief. So far, Aegor hadn't seen any other pyromancers. It seemed the Alchemists' Guild had declined significantly. Those who remained likely worked in shifts. When they first arrived, Halline had taken them straight to the cellar to buy wildfire. Now, retracing their steps, Aegor had his first real chance to examine the guild hall. It was a vast labyrinth built entirely of black stone, its internal structure far more complex than its exterior suggested. Twisting corridors and dimly lit passageways framed by black iron beams led them to a door at the end of yet another hallway. Halline unlocked it, revealing a chamber with a small window, finally a room with natural light. The moment Aegor stepped inside, he knew he was in the right place. A long row of tables filled the room, cluttered with an assortment of jars, vials, and equipment of varying shapes and sizes. Among them, Aegor immediately identified two distinct apparatuses, one for extraction, the other for distillation. This was a chemistry lab, or at the very least the prototype of one. The Alchemists' Guild was not merely a group of fire-obsessed fanatics, it was in essence an early chemical research institution. Why then had they faded into obscurity, replaced by the Meisters of the Citadel? With so much equipment at their disposal, they should have been making chemical discoveries that advanced society, yet all they did was manufacture wildfire. Was this a distortion of human nature or just a tragic loss of curiosity? What do you see? Tyrion asked, noticing Aegor's stunned expression. I see the future, Aegor murmured before turning sharply to Halline. His gaze was piercing. Do you know how to use everything in this room? I mostly. I was trained after all, Halline admitted hesitantly, but I haven't practiced in years. I'd need time to reacquaint myself with the equipment. Looked around, rubbing his hands nervously. We should step out. This room isn't entirely safe. Aegor nearly choked. Not safe? I thought the wildfire was stored in the cellar. Is there anywhere in this guild that is safe? Not really, Halline pointed at the ceiling. There are mechanisms built into it. If an accident occurs, if a fire breaks out, the ceiling will collapse, releasing a large amount of sand from the compartment above to smother the flames. In theory, that should prevent any catastrophe. In theory, Aegor echoed, narrowing his eyes. It hasn't been maintained in over a decade, Halline admitted sheepishly. So I'm not sure if it still works. Aegor glanced up. Sure enough, the ceiling looked dangerously heavy, as if it might collapse at any moment. That was enough to make him reconsider stepping any further inside. Instead, he backed out quickly. Before leaving, he turned to Halline. Master Halline, remember what I said. When you're free, come find me. Once outside, Tyrion could no longer hold back his curiosity. What exactly do you want that man for? He asked. He's no master pyromancer, probably just a glorified assistant. The wildfire he makes is likely subpar. I don't need wildfire, I need him, or more precisely, his knowledge of how to use the equipment in that room. Aegor mounted his horse and looked back at the decrepit but still standing Alchemists' Guild Hall. Where I come from, there's a substance similar to wildfire but more stable and far more powerful. It's called gunpowder. More stable and more powerful? Tyrion's eyes narrowed. He wasn't a warrior, but his mind was sharp and he understood war better than most nobles. It took him only a moment to grasp the implications. That would change warfare entirely. It could reshape the world. Exactly, Aegor said, his expression unreadable. Do you know how to make this gunpowder? Tyrion's voice dropped to a whisper. I know it and I don't, Aegor replied cryptically. That's why I need someone to help me figure it out. He gave his horse a nudge forward. By the way, you seemed oddly familiar with the wildfire trade. How come? Oh, that, Tyrion smirked. There's a Myrish juggler in Robert's court, Thoros. He's known for fighting with a flaming sword. Turns out he paints wildfire on the blade before battle. I once bought him a drink and asked him how it worked. That's when I learned he buys the wildfire here from the Alchemists' Guild. So that's the trick, Aegor muttered. He had once thought the flaming swords in the show were a sign of Arlor's divine power. Turns out it was just a cheap pyrotechnic trick. Let's head back, Aegor said, shifting in the saddle. Things are about to get busy. Best to enjoy what little rest we have while we still can, Tyrion chuckled. For once, I agree, let's go. Karl Marx once wrote in the economic manuscripts, gunpowder, the compass, and printing, these are the three great inventions that heralded the rise of bourgeois society. Gunpowder blew apart the feudal knights, the compass opened the world to markets and colonies, and printing became the weapon of Protestantism, the revival of science, and the most powerful force in shaping the intellectual foundations of a new era. Now, things were about to get interesting. Gunpowder, or more precisely black powder, is composed of 1 part sulfur, 2 parts nitrate, and 3 parts charcoal. The formula is simple and easy to remember, and many people can memorize it at a glance. This ratio represents the reactive components, though in actual practice an optimized mass ratio is used. Aegor recalled a more precise composition, 2:15:3. Beyond just remembering the formula, he also knew that sulfur and charcoal referred to elemental sulfur and carbon, while nitrate specifically meant potassium nitrate. He could even write out the chemical reaction equation for an explosion, not that it was something to boast about. It was basic knowledge, easily grasped in high school. However, knowing the principles of gunpowder and being able to immediately produce large quantities of it for practical use were two entirely different matters. After all, Aegor wasn't a chemist or a geologist, nor had he ever made the substance himself, and even if he could, he wouldn't be able to use it just yet. The reason was simple: gunpowder was too powerful a weapon. At present he was still living under someone else's roof, in other words, under the protection of the Iron Throne, more specifically under the indirect protection of Eddard Stark. Though the latter likely wasn't even aware of it, the fact remained. So long as Eddard remained in power, Aegor had a degree of safety. That reality would not change simply because Eddard happened to be familiar with the real story or had secretly saved him in the past. Until he built a force that was loyal to him and him alone, manufacturing gunpowder would only serve to benefit others. The moment word of it got out, the ruling class of Westeros would swoop in and seize it. They'd use it in their endless wars, and war was indiscriminate. As a neutral Night's Watch officer, Aegor's greatest asset in navigating the various political factions was balance. If that balance were broken, the Seven Kingdoms would descend into chaos. Apart from the North, perhaps no other faction would hesitate to turn on him. And if war engulfed Westeros, the loss of his financial assets would be the least of his concerns. Worse still, if he was killed by the very technology he introduced, it would be nothing short of a cosmic joke. As a time traveler, Aegor was perfectly happy to enjoy the company of beautiful women in this world, but experiencing cannon fire and battlefield artillery firsthand, while that might sound like a man's romance to some, he'd rather not. The ideal future would be to find a powerful patron, or better yet, build his own power base. Only then could he unleash this devastating weapon at the most critical moment. For example, if the Seven Kingdoms miraculously avoided civil war, he could introduce gunpowder when the White Walkers attacked. But if war was inevitable, he would use the chaos to his advantage, making sure that before the various factions could reverse engineer gunpowder for themselves, he would demonstrate its absolute superiority. Equivalence is truth, range is justice. By crushing his enemies in a decisive blow, he could secure his place at the pinnacle of power. From there he could either enjoy life in this world indefinitely or search for a way to return home, whichever suited him best. Alas, Aegor couldn't help but lament how much easier things would have been if he had been reborn as a prince instead. If he had inherited a title, a fief, and loyal subordinates from the start, life would have been much simpler. Planning too far ahead was pointless. For now, aside from recruiting a few alchemists as a contingency plan, his more immediate concern was the defense of the wall. Wildfire was incredibly dangerous in the warm climate of the south, but on the cold, desolate wall, it could function as an effective explosive provided it was handled carefully. While waiting for the first Night's Watch factory to be completed, Aegor spent time experimenting with the bottle of wildfire he had purchased, carefully pouring out a few milliliters at a time and testing its properties. "Don't get too close," he warned Arya, who was watching him intently. "If I catch fire, throw that bucket of water on me." The girl giggled, agreeing without hesitation. To her, it was perfectly natural for her adventurous master to play with fire. With a great deal of caution and preparation, Aegor avoided any serious accidents. Before long, he had reached a few important conclusions. First, wildfire was much less dense than water, which was obvious. Light oils always floated. Not only did wildfire float on water, but it could also burn despite being submerged. This explained how in the original story Tyrion had used it to incinerate Stannis' fleet on the Blackwater. Second, it was insanely flammable. Even though body heat alone couldn't ignite it, almost anything else could. Drip it onto hot ground, it ignites. Leave it under direct sunlight for 30 seconds, it ignites. Snap your fingers near it, the friction-generated heat might ignite it. Aegor didn't have a thermometer, but after repeated tests he estimated that any temperature above 50 degrees C, 122 degrees F could cause spontaneous combustion. And that wasn't all. Wildfire had extremely low surface tension, meaning it soaked into anything it touched and seeped into the smallest crevices. This was a terrifying trait for a flammable liquid. It ensured that once ignited, the fire would spread rapidly and be nearly impossible to extinguish. Good stuff. He was already looking forward to seeing it unleashed on the Whites. Aegor later sought out the pyromancer, hoping to recruit him into the Night's Watch. Unfortunately, he was flatly rejected. It was no surprise. The very mention of serving the Night's Watch triggered deep-seated fears in most people. For older individuals like Halling, this fear was even more ingrained. No matter how Aegor tried to explain that his offer was different, the old man refused to budge. In the end, he let it go. Not everything could go his way. He was just a minor officer of the Night's Watch after all. Not every endeavor would succeed. But time was on his side. Once the Night's Watch's industrial ventures grew, once they forged stronger economic ties with the nobles of King's Landing and the Crownlands, money and power would do what words could not. When the time came, Aegor would return to the Alchemists' Guild with an offer they couldn't refuse. His first major investment was secured, and the future looked promising. Yet just as Aegor was celebrating his progress, a piece of shocking news threw him into turmoil. During a casual conversation with Arya, she inadvertently revealed something extraordinary. A group of major Vale lords, including Lord Jon Royce of Runestone, Lady Anya Waynwood of Ironoaks, and Lord Gerald Hunter of Longbow Hall, had secretly formed an alliance and launched a coup. Calling themselves the Alliance of the Righteous, They had seized the Bloody Gate, taking control of the Vale with minimal bloodshed. Now they had completely surrounded the Eyrie, besieging Lysa Arryn without attacking. Their demands: Lysa Tully must hand over young Lord Robert Arryn for proper education. She must submit to trial for the suspected murder of Jon Arryn. The noble houses of the Vale would jointly raise and mentor Robert Arryn as their future ruler. A formal declaration had been issued from Runestone and was already on its way to King's Landing. Arya had overheard this explosive news from a conversation between her father and his advisors. Without realizing its significance, she had casually relayed it to Aegor, making him the second person in King's Landing to know, right after the royal court. "Oh, this is incredible. Absolutely incredible. Yohn Royce really is something else. No wonder his son, Waymar Royce, is so ruthless. Like father, like son, the way he's handled this situation is nothing short of spectacular." Aegor had only meant to stir up rumors to bring down Littlefinger, but rumors are like Pandora's box. Once opened, they take on a life of their own. And now, this particular storm had completely spun out of his control. It had spread beyond King's Landing, igniting chaos in the Vale. The Vale, originally one of the few regions that stayed neutral during the War of the Five Kings, preserving its strength throughout the entire conflict, was now the first place to descend into turmoil. On a personal level, Aegor couldn't help but feel a sense of schadenfreude over the siege of the Eyrie. But in the grand scheme of things, he wasn't just a bystander. He was playing a different kind of game, one that involved raising capital, leveraging financial strategies, and laying the groundwork for an enterprise built on advanced technology. This wasn't a game that could be played in isolation. No matter how slow information traveled or how difficult long-distance communication was in this world, the ripple effects of every major event would reach him eventually. And now, Aegor had to wonder, would this sudden civil war in the Vale end up disrupting his own plans?
Author's note: this chapter crosses a dangerous threshold, from green flame to black powder, from survival to reshaping history itself. Aegor now holds knowledge that could shatter thrones, yet restraint becomes his sharpest discipline. And just as fire is tamed, the Vale ignites proof that once chaos begins, even a careful hand may not stop the spread. This chapter ends here, but the nation endures. More words and legends await on Fanfic Nation, where imagination rules, and every story begins with a choice. Subscribe and return for the next legend.